Okay, look, we have now the opportunity to question our two contributors. Michael, of course, has given us an overview of where the Australian economy is going, and his comments were, I think, leaving us a little positive about where the Australian economy currently sits, although, as we were discussing before we started today, one day you get a set of numbers that come out and everybody says it's fabulous, and then the next day there's another set of numbers that come out that show that, again, we've gone backwards at a rapid rate when it comes to exports, and there's been revision on some of the statistical data that underpinned how excited we were before. So it is a bit of a movable feast. You get a set of circumstances where one day you get statistics coming out that wages growth in Australia are probably the lowest it's been for quite some time, and then the next day you get the Fair Work Commission comes out and hands down a judgment saying that those that are some of the lowest paid can in fact become even lower paid. So the circumstances and the mixture between economics and politics, I think, has never perhaps been less clear in Australia from my observation. I've been watching it for a little while. And certainly I think the opportunity then to try and unpack some of that and some of the issues that might flow from that are provided to us now. So look, again, we have roving microphones. Don't be afraid, don't be shy. If you've got a question, put your hand up, let me know who you are. Ask a question. Let's not get into the debate. I'll do that up here. But if you do have a question, please. Thank you. Over to my right.
Hello, Emmanuel Alfieri from the Commonwealth Bank. Lenore, in particular, keen to understand what the prospects of fundamental economic reform, particularly some of the things that Rob mentioned today on the intergenerational issues that we face as an economy and a country, be it social infrastructure or affordable housing or income inequality. Do you think that there is a political environment to address this? And if there is, which areas do you think could sneak in to look at reform?
I think it is pretty depressing, you'd have to say, what the prospects are. I think the two areas that I think there may be actually some movement would be infrastructure. I don't know that it's entirely clear how that's going to happen yet, but if you're a government sitting in Canberra and you're trying to do something, anything, infrastructure is one thing if you can line up all the ducks. And it's one of those things where I like a lot of people, I can never quite work out why it's so hard to line the ducks up. But I think that's one area that is occupying the Prime Minister's mind a lot. So that's one, and I'm still waiting to see what they do on housing in the budget. I don't know if you've noticed yesterday, but there was this miraculous sudden flowers blooming amongst property people. Aussie John and the head of Stockland, all these people suddenly saying, oh, yeah, actually they should do something about housing and negative gearing. So you can read this in several ways. One of them is that they just all had the same idea. Another one is that somebody's gone out and said, look, we need you to sort of start softening up the turf for us here. Now, what are the advantages of that? Well, one, if they come up with, I think if they did something, they'd do it on capital gains. One, there's the actual reform. But two, I think it sort of sounds a bit sort of shallow, but I work in the Canberra Press Gallery, but I think just the fact that you're actually seeing a substantive debate about something, that you're having a breakthrough point where people haven't been talking about things for years and suddenly both sides of politics are talking about it, I think would have quite a transformative effect on the way politics is conducted, day to day. I'm not saying it will change it overnight, but so that's sort of a shorter term and a longer term thing. Malcolm Turnbull's, this whole problem-solving thing, he's completely obsessed about the energy security issue, and I think is boring everybody senseless around him on, pumped hydro and all these sorts of things. So I think he does tend to just focus in on issues one at a time. But I think those two are things that, have the potential to, get a few people in the government going and could produce some interesting outcomes.
Great, I'm on. Michael, if I come to you, and again, looking at the statistics that you look at and regularly pore over, the issue around taxation reform and the implications that might have for the business community. Laura's just spoken about the possibility capital gains tax may be being moved. And both sides of politics are talking about housing affordability, how to do it. The Labor Party's more in the negative gearing camp. I think the government would appear to be moving capital gains. What do you think, from an economic perspective, are the most significant taxation reforms that are going to help, again, transform our economy or assist the economy as we're transforming at the moment? Because at one stage, people were talking about GST. We had Ken Henry in Canberra the other day talking about what should be done, but we've had the GST debate, and that was swept off the table. That was despite, I think, former Premier Baird and Premier Wetherill from South Australia being the stalking horses and going out on behalf of the federal government and then getting whacked in the head for their trouble. So, you can understand why you have a problem bringing people together to do that. But what would you suggest business believes is most significant in that tax reform debate, and where does that cut in the company tax rate that we've heard so much about, where do you think that might play?
Sure. Well, I think it's just another illustration of just how difficult it is to do any kind of serious reform in Australia. I mean, you've only got to think back 12 months and we were going to have this big tax reform debate. Everything was on the table for discussion, and I think within a matter of weeks that table was pretty empty. It's really the typical story. It's always very easy to identify who the losers are from any reform. And not surprisingly, they make the noise, and the squeaky wheel does end up getting the most oil in the end. The potential winners, well, they tend to sit on the sidelines and not say very much. So I think if you're thinking about the sort of political backdrop, what sort of strikes me is we go about it the wrong way in a sense. So we talk about, well, what kind of tax change would we like to make? Without really thinking about what does that mean for the spending side, or we put up these, some very worthwhile spending initiatives without really thinking about how we're going to pay for them. So it seems to me you've got to have this integrated debate if you want to get to an outcome that everybody can accept, and the one that will deliver benefits for the economy overall. And I think one simple change you could do here really is when you look at just say the budget deficit debate, we all focus on that one number, and that's all it's ever about. Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it too big? Is it too small? But if we kind of split that budget number up into two, let's say the bit that's to do with recurrent spending and income, and then the other, the infrastructure task, well, then we could have a serious debate about infrastructure and the benefits there and how we're going to pay for it, and then we could have a serious debate on the other side about how we're going to pay for the various initiatives that we want to do. So. I think if you can get that bit right, then a lot of these other issues really fall into line. When you come back to taxes more generally, well, it's pretty clear that we're overweight taxes on individual incomes in Australia, and so you need to kind of redistribute the burden there. Equally, it is an interconnected world, and we need to kind of keep up with developments that are happening elsewhere. And of course, we hear President Trump's policies about cutting company taxes a long way in the US. In the UK, they're talking about doing the same thing. Theresa May wants to have the lowest tax rate amongst the corporate tax rate amongst the advanced economies. When the other players are moving, you can't really just sit on the sidelines yourself. So it's got to be, I think, a focus along those sorts of lines. The benefits, unfortunately, like a lot of economics, you can do all sorts of modelling work that proves one thing and another. But certainly the theory says that's the sort of direction we probably should be pushing in here.
Okay. Laura, I mean, from a political perspective, again, it does raise the question where both major political parties have got particular attitudes towards taxation. It's always been thus. I mean, some years ago, Treasurers advocating the adoption of what was effectively a consumption tax model. it was a Prime Minister, a Liberal Prime Minister, introduced the GST. Most economists would probably argue today if you had taxation reform that embraced lifting the rate of GST, perhaps broadening it, then the money that would come in would be given to the states that then have to prop up the hospitals and the education system and so on, but that there had to be trade-offs. You hear about company taxes and so on that Michael's just spoken about. But the politics of Canberra today, I mean, is it all a lost cause? I mean, can we actually get something that's going to mean genuine reform and stimulate or underpin Australia's economic sustainability?
Well, a few points. I think, obviously, as Michael said and as you said, that we had that push for tax reform, but I think it actually sort of collapsed on itself. I'm not sure if we talked about this last year or not, but essentially, by the time Turnbull became Prime Minister and called that sort of mini summit, the GST increase had been spent about 4 times. The states were going to get some and we were all going to get a tax cut. Oh, God, it was wonderful. And it had actually become impossible because you were going to get all these losers because the expectations were so ridiculous. So he comes in, looks at it and goes, well, how do we cut the company tax and put the GST up and make that sellable? And it was called the going into the study and getting out the service revolver option of tax reform. And I think this points to the fact that, as I was alluding to in my speech, you need to actually start reframing. You can't just keep having these same conversations over and over again. Now, in Cabinet in the last few months, there has been a sort of below-the-line, sort of fairly quiet conversation about which I wish I knew a lot more, but they have been going through and looking at all the various tax mechanisms, not the really obvious ones like the GST, but things like the Medicare levy and how it is applied, who pays it, extra bits that have been added onto it over the years, how it's indexed, whatever. So there's a lot of discussion going on about just cleaning up the tax base. Another example would be the petroleum resource rent tax. Now that's potentially worth about $6 billion a year. And there's a really good reason for doing that because it was designed when interest rates were 13% or more. So it provides these huge discounts to miners and resource companies. So there are lots of bits of the revenue base that the average mum and dad conversation isn't concerned with. But I think that is a starting point that they are looking at. But without a doubt, Michael mentioned both President Trump and Theresa May in the UK. I think the Brexit push will be the most important one in terms of the corporate tax politics because I've just been in Europe and nobody's quite sure how any of that's going to work. But the one sort of real realpolitik bargaining chip that the UK has against EU is the city, and people in Europe will concede this. We can't match the city, so that the British government's biggest interest is in maintaining the absolute leadership of the city in a financial sense, maintaining the UK's role as a financial hub. So that gives it an incentive way beyond sort of like an ideological or sort of rhetorical position of President Trump to be talking about lower company tax, and that'll keep the whole thing burning.
I don't want to. Well, I have a question here. Thank you.
Yeah, Charles Arini from the University of Wollongong. This would be sort of an open question. I mean, you've been discussing Trump's lowering the corporate tax rate and the nationalistic trends that we're starting to see across the world globally. Is that not going to create a contagion to, well, if you're going to lower your tax rates, we're going to lower ours to try to keep more money home? And what would happen if that kind of contagion actually occurred?
Oh, for sure. We all like to have level playing fields, so if somebody's shifting one end of that playing field, you've got to do something to keep up with it. So you may get forced to do things that you may not have done otherwise, but it is a very competitive global backdrop, and you do need to maintain your position in that. So we cannot ignore it. The related issue here, I think, is that there are a lot of countries around the world that have relied on growing sort of global trade as a key part of what drives their economies. And what we're really talking about now is a sort of a set of issues over and beyond the tax side that are potentially going to be negative for that part of the story. And for a lot of those countries, and a lot of them are in Asia, so important for us. Well, if you can't rely on trade to drive growth, it's all about the domestic economy, and it's all about, from a policy sense, how do you keep all that domestic growth within your economy rather than sort of leaking out into somebody else's. And a lower currency is a very effective way of doing that, and it then sort of plays into all sorts of other policy issues as well. So that's why I think a lot of the risk here is it relates to that trade and currency story, and then you get the overlay of any sort of tax war going on with those trade and currency wars. I should also point out here is that Trump hasn't actually done anything on the trade front yet, but we've now had 5 years where global trade restrictions have been going up, so we can't say it's just him. This is a global story that is playing out here.
There's also just if you think about the way politicians have to respond in these circumstances, if everybody's cutting their tax, yes, that you've got to be competitive there, but that leaves a glaring problem, which is you don't have any money to do things and you're going to be building a giant wall and various other things. That's going to make debt incredibly fashionable again, and so it might see that you might actually see a divergence between, or a greater divergence between the markets and political rhetoric around the world about how bad debt is. And going back to Michael's point about infrastructure, you might actually start to hear people say, "Oh yes, well, debt for good debt. Good debt is a good thing." So it might start to change a lot of the language you hear about things like that.
I tweeted that after one of the EPOs. Good debt is good, I said. Thank you for reinforcing that.
I'll give you money later.
Yeah, just some former colleagues probably don't believe. But look, I wonder, just final question, because I do know that we have to get out of here, and I will tell you all to get out of here in a minute, but the whole question about the way our political system is at the present moment. You alluded to it, Laura, about changing leaders and so on. Disunity is death, as we all know, and we've seen that. We live in an era of what appears to be, at least within the broader community, a view that, and of course the current federal government came within one seat of feeling that as well, and in Queensland we saw it after less than 3 years, a massive turnaround there. We saw in Victoria a one-term government again. That view that you got at least 2 terms in government to get something done seems to have disappeared, and then, as Michael's figure shows, there is this group of people in the middle that don't seem to feel that they've benefited anything, and their income show that they haven't benefited from the changes that have occurred. Where do we tap into a leadership vein that helps explain that? Because Malcolm Turnbull was viewed as being the great communicator, but we don't seem to be seeing that. At the state level, we've had some terrific people that have that ability to do so. Where do we then get the people hooked into this? And particularly, I might say, in the era of social media. I mean, I talked about tweeting and so on about today, but again, the Prime Minister stood up on election night and blamed social media for almost bringing his government undone by a tweet that went out about Medicare. How do we sort of bring all that together and get leadership in an era of changing methodologies in campaigning and providing information to people so that they do understand that the economic benefits that come through globalisation, trade, changing economic circumstances, the benefits that come through the fourth industrial revolution. How do we do it? Can you solve that for me today?
Okay,
please?
Fine. No, not a hard job. A few thoughts that I think are worth considering. One of them, going back to Michael's presentation about the end of the income recession, we tend to not think about, and we don't talk about that underlying, the underlying wave or the underlying level of a sense of prosperity that people have. And one of the reasons why politics has been going badly here, but particularly in the US, is because wages haven't been going up. It's pretty basic. But it's taken people quite a long time to, maybe that's why people are really pissed off. So if the income level's going up, people won't be, over the next couple of years feeling quite as grumpy as they previously were. The next point, I think, is about messaging. And I'd go to the Fair Work Commission decision last week as an example of that. I've written about that today. And it's a classic thing where the government was going, oh my God, they'll blame us, work choices, panic, panic. Instead of going, hang on, what's the decision? We should explain it. We should explain how it might actually affect people. It might have actually had a really different effect on the way the politics of that played out. And finally, I think we all tend to sort of look at the sort of issues of politics once again, through left-right prisms, leadership, mechanics, all that stuff. I think George Megalogenis makes a really powerful argument in his, a few quarterly essays ago, I think, now I've lost track, but where he essentially says the Victorian government has changed hands for the last 3 times because people couldn't get on a train. And it's that simple sort of fact that people forget that the mechanics of government, the mechanics of what governments provide, is what most people see as their interaction with the government. So if you can sort of try to get politicians to actually start thinking about how they look at that level and start talking about it in terms that sound like they're doing something about it, I think you'll start to address that interconnection, because there's nothing you can do about social media, there's nothing you can do about the irrationality of it, but if you talk about things that actually, of people's frontline issues, and state governments in particular, I think are now the equivalent of what local councils were in our youth, that might start to change things.
Hasn't been the same since '96, I've told you that many times, Laura. But look, unfortunately it has come to the end of this opportunity to question both our 2 panellists today. Could you please thank them on behalf of us and CEDA?